Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Fresh Off the Set. I am Kami Stroot.
And I'm Laura Murray. So today's podcast, it's so important. It's a little sensitive, it's a little deep, it's powerful. Carrie sat down with an author, Clarissa, who wrote a book about basically helping kids through grief. And honestly, having gone, I don't think anyone can go through life without feeling some sort of grief. And grief is really not linear. Grief has its ups and downs, and all of a sudden I feel like, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Kami, but sometimes you will all of a sudden just be hit with a wave of grief and you don't know where it came from, especially when it comes to people that you miss or love.
Absolutely. This world is hard and there is not a rule book when it comes to grief. And like you said, you can be thinking you're going through it or that you have maybe either go through counseling or however you want to deal with it, but you think that you're done and all of a sudden it just comes out. Perfect example of this is I wouldn't wish it on my worst nightmare. My sister lost my nephew when he was 13 months, almost 14 months, had just had his first birthday and we had no signs or symptoms. And it was awful. And she had two other children who were in the house whenever he was found. And I wasn't a mother then. I was Aunt KK and I was there. And I mean, I have goosebumps right now, actually, just talking about the story. And when my son was born, this was literally a year and a half later, my son was born. The first 24 hours, I just cried thinking about Case. And I thought I had gone through it and I had gotten help. So this is going to be such an amazing topic because I don't care who you are, whether you know someone or what you've gone through grief.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's important to know that grief is okay to feel.
100%.
It's okay to feel grief. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to mourn. And so obviously Clarissa is going to, talk about this better than I can. So let's toss it over to Carrie and Clarissa.
Awesome.
Well, today's podcast, although very sad topic, very crucial that we talk about this. Clarissa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. I want to read a couple statistics really quick. So we're talking about loss and grief today, and I'm reading that 1 in 15 kids in Utah will experience the death of a parent or sibling during their childhood. That means 63,000 kids in the state are grieving. How is grief impacting this generation of teenagers, Clarissa?
I appreciate you asking that question because grief is becoming a cultural epidemic for teenagers. We know that teenagers who have lived through the loss of COVID, the losses that have come with that over the last few years, are grieving. We know the Surgeon General has issued a statement saying that teen mental health is in crisis. And, it doesn't take much to look at the headlines and see that grief is written all over the news these days. School shootings, deaths of despair. There are a lot of things that are hemming teenagers in these growing up years, causing them to carry a lot of sorrow in their backpacks as they head to school and about in the world.
Sure, there is so much. Absolutely. That's very true. What are the most common struggles teens have after losing a loved one?
Well, teens wrestle with the same things that adults do when they lose a loved one. They experience disruptions of sleep. They have appetite changes. They may feel a lack of energy or a sense of feeling wired, like they can't settle in. And all of these physiological struggles are very common, but with time, they tend to ebb away. But it's the deeper struggles that teenagers have, I think, that are the longer term ones. Those feelings of isolation. My friends don't know how to talk to me anymore. I don't have anyone to talk to about this. And then those questions about the future. Teenagers know that life is going to change when a loved one dies, and they can forecast what that change is going to mean for them. And that can be a real struggle as they're processing futures that are supposed to have a lot of hope.
That's a good point. What would you say are the risks to students as they are going through that, as they are processing loss?
I think the risks primarily for students are around community. We know that students tend to self-isolate, that they lick their wounds. They don't want to talk to adults in their lives when they have difficulties. They may seek out social media for answers or answers from their peers. And that's really complicated when it comes to grief, because even though grief is a unique and personal experience, it's also universal. There are many things to be learned from shouldering that burden with someone else. And so when students self-isolate, it can cause a lot of struggles for them, not just in the immediate, but also in the long term as well. I think for students too, there is a risk also to, how shall I say it, to think about their futures as limited and limited by their loss. I've lost my sibling and my life will always be different. I've lost grandma and holidays will always be different. And there's a self-limiting that we don't want to see our teenagers have as they move into adulthood. For those who have lost a loved one, they carry wisdom beyond their years. They know how their loss will mark them, but we want to encourage them toward resilience, toward an honest assessment of their loss. And by doing these things, we can mitigate some of those risks for students, both now and for their future years.
Okay, now when we talk about teens and students and kids, we've mentioned kind of all of that. What ages are we talking about?
Well, developmentally, we're talking about 12, 13, all the way into the upper teens. 18, 19, and even into your 20s. This is a wide range. We know this as parents, as teachers, as youth leaders and coaches. There can be a lot of maturity differences in that range. But all of these students differ very much from children when they interact with loss. Children are very concrete. They might ask a question like, what is cremation? Or can grandma breathe underground after they visited a cemetery? They have very concrete questions. They don't think a lot about the future. They don't ask a lot of why questions, those hard questions that we as adults also wrestle with. And that's really where we see a distinction in terms of who's a teen and who's a child. If you have a child who is very interested in sort of the elemental, the concrete questions around a loss, you know that you're dealing with someone who has a younger conception of what death and dying and grief mean. And if you start to have questions that you can't answer, chances are you've got a teenager.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for explaining that. That makes sense. What support structures do students need, would you say, to survive bereavement?
Well, for most students, they need a small core of support. And this core can come from peers who treat them like they're normal, who stay in contact with them, who don't keep them isolated, but kind of move in, lean into those relationships, even when a student feels like they want to pull away. But peers aren't the only support structures that are needed. In fact, adverse childhood experiences research tells us that one committed adult can make a tremendous difference in a child's life. And so that one committed adult may be a teacher, it may be a school counselor, a coach, a parent, an aunt or an uncle, any adult who says, I'm going to stay, I'm going to listen, and I'm going to be with you for the long haul. These are the kind of support structures that really make a difference when a student is trying to survive.
I like that. I like the key word that I got out of that was committed. Committed,
yes.
One, and just one.
That's right. Even one makes a difference.
Okay. That kind of ties into the next question. What is the role of parents when a student has lost a loved one? That's we could probably talk for a long time about that, but let's sum it up for us with the role of parents when a student is going through loss.
Yeah, well, I lost my husband in 2019 in a hiking accident on our family vacation.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much. It has been a tremendous change in our family life, to say the least. And I've parented my own children through the developmental stages of moving from childhood and elementary school into junior high and high school and now into college. And the role of parents is really unique in grief because there's nothing a parent can do to make it easier, to make it better, to make the pain go away. There's a powerlessness that's really hard for parents when they watch their child grieving. And so what I have found to be particularly helpful is to become a student of my child, to be a curious observer, to be a patient question answerer, or answerer or asker, to be a good listener. All of these things are things that don't need any kind of specialized training, but it's a real slowing down for us parents, a realization that the process is just as important as what we hope to be the product or their flourishing in their later years.
I think that's a really good point. So you mean if if a child or if a teen is, asking questions that you may not have the answers, you could kind of turn it to, well, what do you think is the answer?
That's
or
right.
What do you think? So make, kind of that probably opens up their mind and their curiosity and maybe some comfort to be able to answer that for themselves.
Yeah, or let's figure this out together. You don't know, I don't know. How can we learn together? There's something about that kind of partnership, that honesty that teenagers really do find appealing.
That's really good. I have a question for you too. How much do we talk about grief with our teen, with our student, in your opinion? And everyone's different, so it's hard to say, once a week, or there really isn't like a timeline, right? But, when do you think we're bringing it up too much or not enough? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think if we look at our culture, we could honestly say we're talking about death and grief all the time. Our students watch violent movies, they watch sad movies, they listen to violent music, or they hear about death on TikTok, or in videos, on video games. We are inundated with messages about grief and loss and death. But those messages aren't always healthy. They're culturally embedded, but are they embedded with the values of your family, with hope and resilience, with the honesty about the raw ache that comes with loss? And so, when we're thinking about those conversations between adults and students, I say, you can't talk about it too much. It is kind of like the birds and the bees conversation. If you try to do a one and done, you're going to have some squirming. You may have some people who want to run out of the room. But if we take it a little bit at a time, pulling on a headline to start a conversation, or a question from a song lyric for a conversation, slowly integrating conversations about death and dying and grief into our everyday talks with our kids, I think we're actually building a really healthy foundation so that when they interact with those big moments, the loss of a friend at school, the loss of a family member that they love very much, they have some sort of language to use to express what they're going through.
That's really good. Thank you for that. And this next question is kind of interesting, but I'm going to ask it because I think I know the answer, but I would love your opinion on this. How long does it take for a student to adjust after the death of their person?
I really like that you used the word adjust, because I think adjustment is what we hope for. If we use the word healing, if we use the word recovery, I think we're setting up our students for a really tough road to hoe, almost setting them up for an impossible task. We know in adulthood that old hurts die hard, that there are wounds that we carry from our childhood that even if we have dealt with them in healthy ways, there's still a twinge sometimes. And we should expect that students will feel the same when they experience the loss of a loved one. But students can adjust. They're amazingly resilient. And I always like to tell teens, it is not possible that you will thrive after loss. It is probable. If you desire that, if you seek it out, if you interact with your grief honestly instead of pushing it away, you will adjust to this new life without your person. Will it hurt? Yes, it will still hurt. But will you learn new patterns of communication, of support, of self-care to help you through this? Yes, you will. And the amazing thing with teenagers is the lessons they learn now, they're going to be able to apply for the rest of their lives. We're really equipping them for their emerging adulthood.
That's good. Thank you, Clarissa. That's really good. And this actually leads into the next question. Let's talk about the hidden gifts of grief. That may sound funny because you're thinking, grief is loss and, what gift comes from that. But there are hidden gifts of grief.
That's so true. And you know what's amazing? There was a New York Life Foundation bereavement study that charted the answers that students gave to reflections on their own childhood losses. And there were two things that these students noted that they said were just so important to them, things that they realized they never could have experienced if it hadn't been for this hard thing that they had gone through. First, they said they'd been able to move forward. And that forward motion is just an incredible gift. They had learned tenacity. They had learned perseverance. They had learned a sense of hopefulness that even when there are dark clouds shattering my now, there can be a bright tomorrow ahead. And the second thing that they noted was that it prepared them not only to face other hard stuff in life, but to walk beside other people who had experienced hard things as well. So it fostered within them both resilience and compassion. And I think when we're talking, and there's a lot of talk in school systems about developing empathy and compassion toward one another, it's certainly something we want to foster in our culture today. Sometimes facing the hardest thing that you've ever had to face can be the key that unlocks that compassionate spirit in your own life. And that's certainly what we hope for teens as they wrestle through these very hardest experiences that they've had.
Okay, and what advice would you give to someone who may be listening right now who's experienced recent loss and they're just feeling absolutely lost in their grief?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is that you are not alone. There's an isolation that comes with grief that feels like it just envelops you, but you are not alone. And so the first step toward finding an anchor, being moored in your grief, is to reach out. And it's hard to reach out because we feel like everybody else should be reaching out to us. But sometimes it's just your one text saying, hey, would you come and sit with me? Or, hey, could you bring me a cup of coffee or meet me for a cup of coffee? It's that one interaction, that one reaching out that can begin a chain of support that builds and strengthens over time, offering you a way of pulling yourself out of that very dark space and into the light again.
Reach out a little bit. It's true. You kind of feel like, well, I need people to reach out to me, but it feels good, almost like as a release of like weight on your shoulders to reach out and just say, I need a little bit of help. A cup of coffee would be great. That's so true, to reach out. And on the flip side, oftentimes we don't know how to help those, especially if you haven't experienced loss, how to help someone. What can we do to support those around us who are grieving?
Well, the first thing that you could do is cross out this phrase from your script. Let me know if you need anything. We never want to say, let me know if you need anything.
Oh, Clarissa, that is so, oh my gosh, that is so true. You hit the nail on the head. Exactly. Get rid of it.
Yes, get rid of it. Get rid of it. Don't say, let me know if you need anything. Instead, get creative. Knowing how hard it is for a grieving person to actually reach out, you be the proactive one. Be the proactive one to drop a cup of coffee on their desk at work, to text and volunteer to pick their kids up at soccer practice, to bring a meal, or better yet, just slip a gift card in somebody's bag so that they can do DoorDash for the evening. All of these kind of very simple proactive things say you care. And really, for most folks, that's all they need. They're not looking for dramatic words of kindness and consolation. They know you're going to fumble when you're trying to say that you care. What they're looking for is, do you care and will you stick around? And so 3 months after a loss, 6 months after a loss, a year after a loss, maybe stick it in the notes on your phone so that you get pinged. Oh, you know what? It's the anniversary of somebody's loss. I'm just going to text them today and let them know I'm thinking of them. Those kind of small gestures go such a long way.
That is so true. That is so, so true. Be specific and, like a gift card or just dropping off something at the door because they may not necessarily want to see anyone at the time. Drop off like a Costco-sized box of tissues at their door or, so just be specific. That is so true. Okay, on the flip side, what should we avoid doing, in your opinion?
Well, I think one of the things that can be tempting to do when we're trying to support a person who has lost someone is to find some point of similarity in their life. Hey, your aunt died. Oh, you know what? I remember when my aunt died. And suddenly the storytelling becomes about you and your experience. And so instead of telling your own stories, and there will be a time for that, sit, listen, affirm, reflect back to that person what you're hearing. Maybe just hold a hand and sit in silence. There will be a time for you to speak, but chances are at the beginning of grief, when it is very raw and deep, that's not the moment.
Good advice. Very good advice. Okay, and you are a award-winning author, Clarissa. Why did you decide to write a book specifically for teens facing loss?
Well, there are a lot of really great resources out there that deal with many of these physical symptoms that students will have, the emotional symptoms. But one of the things that we found in our research with school chaplains and therapists and hospice volunteers, teachers, was that students were asking a lot of deep soul questions also after the death of a loved one. They were asking questions about God, about the afterlife, about why bad things happen to good people. And those are the questions that don't have easy answers. I think that's kind of why we often avoid them. But they're a big part of the questions that students have as they're growing up. They're sort of those big maturing questions. And so when we thought about developing a guide that would really honor the teen experience, we wanted to have a special section that dealt with those kind of spiritual questions as a way of a gesture of saying, hey, those big questions, we may not know the answer to them, but we will sit, we'll discover them together, we'll sit in the mystery of them together. And in doing so, this question and answer format of the book, we hope will model sort of conversations we hope teens will have with the trusted adults in their lives.
Okay, that's so good. And I relate to this next part so fully. While writing this book, you intentionally avoided using the word healing when describing the grief journey. Why is this word inaccurate?
That's right. Well, researchers tell us that children and adolescents do something called regrieving. That is, as they hit development milestones in their lives, they process their grief in new ways because they have now added maturity, added experience, added knowledge. So if your child lost a loved one when she was, say, 4 or 5, she's going to understand it differently then at that age than she is going to be when she's 12 or when she's 18. And so, say the pain of losing mom when she was 4 or 5 is going to show up in new and sometimes very raw ways when she gets her period, when she's asked to her first prom, when she graduates from high school. And because of that, we want to avoid using the word healing because it sets up students for this sort of stage mentality. Okay, I'm going to work through these steps and then grief's all done. And then when they hit a developmental milestone and they're confronted again with their loss in these new and sharp and painful ways, they say, what's wrong with me? I must have done it incorrectly. When in reality, they're doing just fine. This is how their bodies and their minds and their hearts are processing this loss over the length of their childhood and into adolescence and adulthood.
Oh, that's a really good point. Okay, and throughout your book, you incorporated snapshots of other people's grief journeys. Why did you feel that it was important to include stories from other people?
Well, I wrote this book with my teenage daughter. She's a freshman in college now. And Fiona is a wonderful person. We've got a great relationship. But I knew from the very beginning that we couldn't be the only two voices that students heard. Students need a community. And so we pulled in different voices, a voice of a girl who had lost a friend, a boy who had lost a sibling. We wanted students to never feel like, oh, my grief isn't represented here. This has nothing for me. Because what we want to model for students is in as much as your grief feels like it fills your whole world, like there's nothing that anybody can do to really reach the heart of who you are anymore, because grief covers everything. There is a universality to our experiences of loss that can bind us together and create really deep, beautiful friendships, even out of this hard place. I think about relationships that my daughter Fiona has with other students who have experienced loss. There's just a knowing at the beginning, from the very beginning. Oh, I get you. You haven't experienced it the way I have, but we both know how it feels. And I think that can be a real comfort for students when they feel like there's nobody that understands. Here in this book, you'll find a lot of voices who understand.
Oh, so good. Oh, this podcast. I wish we could talk longer about all of this. It's such food for the soul. You know, you're helping students and parents and human beings through some of the most difficult times of their life. And I'm sure if you're listening right now going through grief and loss, and I'm sure you can appreciate Clarissa's information and your advice, and not feeling alone, which is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Clarissa. If we want to get a copy of your book, what's the best way to do it? Where can we follow you?
Sure. You can find Hurt, Help, Hope anywhere where books are sold. And you can also visit us at my website, ClarissaMoll.com. I love to interact with readers and listeners. It is a deep honor to be able to walk with grieving individuals and families through loss, and to point their feet toward hope and flourishing again.
Oh, you're the best. It's an honor to be able to chat with you. Clarissa, thanks for joining me today. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to another episode of Fresh Off the Set. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next week. Congrats, you made it to the end. If you want to continue to freshen up your day, you can watch us on Fresh Living every weekday on CBS Channel 2 in Utah at 1 o'clock. You can also watch us on our YouTube channel, KUTV Fresh Living, and follow us on social media. We will see you next week.